true in Cleveland. And that was a staggering moment yesterday, because I think most people expect at some point Cleveland will be righted. The ship will make sense, and you'll be able to look at it and say, okay, I understand where the Cavs are headed. Unfortunately for Cavs fans yesterday, on top of hearing over the last 48 hours that maybe LeBron isn't recruiting actively, he's not out there, hearing reports that he's not trying to get people to come, and you hear all these reports that in a year he may want to leave. Well, now a team without a GM, which has been part of the chaos, had somebody they thought in Chauncey Billups wants to take over a team and would be a good fit, and Chauncey Billups has now decided he's not interested and has pulled out of interest in the gig.
Chauncey Billups, a guy who, as the write-up on .com, as I read this and chuckle, thinking about the circumstances here, Billups, 40, has no front office experience, but has gained interest in front office jobs because of his strong reputation and leader and belief that he can make the transition with the proper staff. So a guy that's trying to do this for the first time looked at your situation and said, nah, I'm good. looked at what you have going out there. A perfect place, in my mind, that would have been an interesting starter for Chauncey, in the fact that you go in there year one and you'd have LeBron James, Kyrie, and Kevin Love. You'd have that core there to try and work and build around, which would be one entire set of challenges that we've heard about before. You heard Tyronn Lue call it the hardest coaching job in the NBA, coaching LeBron James. Imagine being David Griffin, who for so long had to be the GM without really getting much credit at all from the outside world because of LeBron. And then the idea that you have to actively try and work in some way to keep him there, and if you don't, then you get to be part of a rebuild. That would be a lot of experience in a short period of time. So what does that tell you is that either Chauncey is maybe doing the most simple thing here and waiting for a good opportunity, a guy like him who has drawn interest, interviewed for the Hawks job also earlier this year, might just be waiting for the right opportunity, or the prospect of working with Dan Gilbert after what we've all seen publicly is such an affront to him that he was like, nope, I'll wait this one out.
And I think if it was any one piece in Cleveland, maybe you could say, hey, that's just a piece. And you talk about Dan Gilbert. If it was just one thing, if it was just Dan Gilbert's not likable, if it was just, hey, they're making a switch at GM, if it was just, hey, LeBron seems a little distant. But at some point you start to look at all of the smoke, and that's where you feel like fire has to exist.
Yeah, that's the part that should be worrisome for Cleveland fans, is all of this looks like signs that lead to LeBron James leaving next summer. The weird thing to me, and going back to LeBron's comment, or the comments about LeBron not actively recruiting this summer free agents. And now I get it. They don't really have a ton of space to work with either. They've been in the luxury tax. That's something that's been a battle back and forth between LeBron James and management there, as he wants them to spend more, and they've already spent more than anyone else over the last 3-year stretch. So you can maybe understand that, but is LeBron James really at the point, too, where as a guy who's 32 years old, not getting any younger, really going to waste a year? That's the one thing I can't reconcile, and why I don't believe he's doing this to actively subvert the organization. Does he hate Dan Gilbert enough after everything that's gone on to say, I might be willing to sacrifice one of the few remaining years of my prime?
Senior NBA writer from ESPN's The Undefeated, Mark Spears, talked about the news yesterday. Wants you to hear it. This is Spears talking about it.
It was somewhat surprising. Hey, look, there's only 1 of 30 of these jobs in the NBA. And he passed on it, and he just told me it wasn't the right fit and it wasn't the right time. He said there was a perception out there that his family did not want him to go to Cleveland. He said that was completely false, that they had his back into the entire thing if he wanted to come to Cleveland. I also asked him, I said, hey, did you consult with LeBron James? He said no. I said, well, is LeBron's situation in Cleveland, the fact that he could be a free agent in 2018, a factor as well? And he said, no, it wasn't. He did consult with Tyronn Lue, the coach, longtime friend. But all in all, Chauncey passes, and Cleveland's still looking for a general manager.
Mike and Mike is presented by Progressive Insurance, comparing rates to help you save. Now that's Progressive. Call or click today and find out how much Progressive could save you. I'm Jason Fitz. He's Mike Golick Jr. We're in for the guys today. And it's interesting because one of the things you just heard Mark Spears say is that Chauncey did not speak with LeBron. And that mirrors something because the Cavs spoke to Tom Izzo to coach in 2010. He said no. And part of his decision was being unable to speak with LeBron. So you look at this, there's sort of a distance that Dan Gilbert is keeping between the people that want to come into the organization. It's almost like he thinks in a perfect world, you're coming to my organization without an understanding, like we said yesterday, that right now it's in the NBA culture, it's not about the organization. It's about the players within the organization. That's the impetus that makes people want to stay, take less money, or come.
Well, because any of those good leaders understand and recognize that if you don't have an understanding and a relationship with your best player, you have nothing. We've seen that fail left and right. That was why I'd argue that Phil Jackson and the Knicks tenure, whatever you want to say about the moves he made, he was never able to establish the right relationship with their best players. And so when you don't have that, it makes it really hard to accomplish anything else. If you can't get LeBron James on board, who forgot being your best player, might be the most important player we've seen in the last decade, how the hell do you expect to get anything done?
Well, it's a fair point, and it leaves everything sort of in question, and that's what's hard for Cleveland fans, and sort of a moment where you have to, not to be too deep, but you have to sort of look back and respect the run you're in, whenever you're in it, because I think if you'd asked Cleveland fans a couple of years ago what the immediate future looks like, they would have felt good about it. They would feel good about the immediate future, much like if you ask Golden State fans today how they feel about the immediate future with Kevin Durant and his signing, you feel good about it. You have to sort of appreciate it, because even in the NBA, especially in the NBA, it turns quickly, because so much of it is based on small rosters and where one player decides to go, which then causes 2 to 3 players to go somewhere. The balance of power changes so quickly that it makes it's hard to sustain that level of success.
And that's what we've seen this offseason. We've seen a lot of the power shift very quickly in response to what's been built out in Golden State. And so the question then becomes is how much does that volatility become the norm going forward? You're right. As we just see, if we go up against Golden State again this year and it's just waves crashing into the rocks and nothing happens, does everyone just reshuffle the deck again next year who's available? We know the notable list of free agents that are coming up next summer. So as much reorganization as we've seen this year, the potential to see that much more next year that could be in response again to Golden State.
Well, speaking of Golden State, I love this on the 1-800.com, 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Somebody came at us and said, if we're praising KD for taking a pay cut, this is Mr. Barry, why aren't we criticizing Steph Curry for not taking a pay cut?
Those things don't have to happen together.
There's absolutely no relationship to the two. I have no problem with the guy getting paid, and that's what Steph Curry went and did. I'm going to praise somebody for deciding, hey, I'll wait on the money. It doesn't mean you're bad if you take the money that's ahead of you. I have no problem with it. I'm not going to fault somebody for maximizing their value, but I will, darn sure, without any respect to that, I'll credit somebody for deciding they want to leave money on the table if it's better for the team and the organization. It just makes sense.
Limited window of earning potential right here. And for Steph Curry, a guy who this wasn't always in the card for. Steph didn't come into the league the way LeBron, the way Durant and these guys did. He came to this star power late. And we know he's certainly made a lot in his career already, and his star has far exceeded everything else. But if there's a part of him that says, I want to be paid like the best guy, I'm not going to begrudge him that, because especially where he came from, this was not expected.
I feel like someday this is going to turn into a 30 for 30, and there are some stories that you just have to hear to believe. Introducing 30 for 30 podcasts, all new stories from the producers of the acclaimed 30 for 30 series. Subscribe now in the Listen tab of the ESPN app or Apple Podcast. Straight ahead, when the stream of NBA talent gets headed west, there could be a major opportunity for some of the Eastern Conference teams in the NBA to take advantage of. We'll look at that next on Mike and Mike. It's Mike and Mike. He's Mike Golick Jr. I'm Jason Fitz sitting in for the guys. Let's get into some of these Twitters. You like that? Some of these tweets. 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Jarrett comes in and says that Mike Golick Jr. has the best 4th of July shirt on, which I don't argue with. I mean, it is the best 4th of July shirt with the Sandlot and the hot dogs and the s'mores. I just think, if I had worn that same shirt today, if the shirts were reversed, Twitter would be throwing me much hate.
Got to be able to fill out the shirt, man.
Well, that is
be able to fill out the shirt.
And somebody also points out, Big Frog points out, Tom Brady's wife makes a lot more than he does. Easy to leave cash on the table with that. I just find it funny when again, I know we're playing with play money, but that's real money to athletes. So it doesn't really matter how much your wife makes. The fact is you have a certain self-confidence of worth. Let's say, I don't want to say ego, but there's a confidence of worth.
There's absolutely an ego that comes in sports. There's no denying that, but it's also no denying these guys have unique situations. And someone else pointed out on Twitter that I saw Kevin Durant's Nike contract, all the outside money that he makes, and that's what allows guys at that top level the flexibility that players underneath them don't have. That doesn't make it any different. I'd always lob it back to people, though, and if it was the difference between $9 million that was offered to you and leaving that on the table, 99.9% of the population is taking that money.
Oh, yeah.
And anyone who denies it is probably just lying to you.
Craig comes in and says, please stop Fitz from calling KD a hero for taking $25 million. Smart for keeping championship team together, but not a hero. This is the 4th of July, man. No, I'm not going to call any NBA player a hero. Let's have a little perspective on what a hero is. I'm not going to stop praising somebody for leaving a bunch of money on the table, though. So if your goal is to get me to stop praising, it's not going to happen. But I'm certainly not going to call anyone, in light of especially today and the world we live in, a hero that plays basketball. That's just one aside from all of that. I know it's too deep. We'll continue the conversation, though, about the Eastern Conference in just a couple of seconds. Mike and Mike on ESPN Radio, ESPN2. Don't forget, in a few minutes, we're going to move over to ESPN News so you can continue to hang out with us there. He's Mike Golick Jr. I'm Jason Fitz. We're sitting in for the guys, presented by Progressive Insurance. All phone guests on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. And you can tweet us as you've been doing all morning. We know that. It's been happening all morning from the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. So, Golick, it's time for Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless. Best phones, best networks, no contracts. Let's have a little bit of straight talk about super teams and what it means to the East, okay? Because we're in a world of haves and have-nots right now in the NBA. And we talked a little bit about it yesterday. Right now, the balance of power completely shifted. The balance of power is over. It's over to the West. That presents a little bit of an opportunity, however, for the East. I can see an opportunity here where if you hate super teams, and we're going to get into sort of judging them in a second, but if you hate super teams and what you want to see is teams build from the ground up and young stars and that sort of new generation of basketball, you can do that over in the East, right?
You can, and I think that's already started to happen. Like we talked about Giannis Antetokounmpo, this playoff run, a guy in Milwaukee who I thought did really well for himself coming into that playoff stretch, becoming a bigger star and a bigger name in NBA circles that he had before. You mentioned the 76ers that get brought up a lot. Joel Embiid last year, I know he fell short of the game requirement where people felt comfortable making him Rookie of the Year, but that's the kind of tear that he was on, and he's extremely entertaining. You've got dynamic personalities all over the place in this league if you just feel like looking.
Well, in the Eastern Conference, it's sort of like that neighborhood that's being renovated. You know, it's up and coming. They use the real estate up and coming thing. It feels like in a couple of years, the East is going to be stacked. There's a lot of young talent there that can grow. It also gives these young guys an opportunity to sort of step up and become stars, because through it all, we're going to be looking at the Eastern Conference continually saying who's there and what's worth watching in that process, because there's going to be, I think, a lot of bad basketball compared to what we see in the West. It will let some of these young guys stand up, and at some point, they're going to make stars of them, because that's what happens. I mean, they're not going to bury every Eastern Conference game on no TV. You're going to have to watch these guys. So they're going to begin to market the Eastern Conference guys. But it's also a reminder that one move here, I mean, Gordon Hayward being the piece that's still sitting out, he could completely change the balance of power, because the East is so tightly compacted right now with bad teams or lesser teams that need to step up.
I still think those stars have been there, though. Like of the Boston Celtics team that we talked about this year, Isaiah Thomas became a certified star. Now, I don't think on the court he's as big of a star as some of the other names that we're going to talk about here, but John Wall and the Wizards, what they were able to do this year and accomplish. John Wall, one of the best, most exciting players, a guy that probably should have gotten some outside MVP consideration in this season. And then we talked about the Bucks, you talked about the Cavs, you talked about the 76ers, and all of a sudden you start to rattle off a decent amount of names there. You had a Miami Heat team that was pretty interesting, at least all those years, and they're one of the teams in the Gordon Hayward sweepstakes. If all of a sudden you add him, that's a viable star player in a huge, great market in Miami that we've seen success in before. And so at the very least, it's interesting and it's entertaining if it's not as competitive as you want.
Well, I agree that the stars are there in the East. I think that there's been a shadow over the East for a long time, and that shadow's LeBron in a good way. I mean, that LeBron's the best thing for basketball. We all know that. I'm not saying that that's a negative to LeBron. I'm just saying that when you think of the East, you usually think of the Cavs and nothing else. And what's happened this summer, particularly when you think of the West, if you think of Golden State and San Antonio, let's argue, and virtually nothing else, at this point, you now think of the West. You think of the West, and there's a half a dozen teams you think of. Do you remember in recent years a number one seed like Boston that got less attention for being a number one seed? Because ultimately, it's the Cavs conference. They own it.
Well, they were getting a lot of that attention, I think, leading up. It was the end of the Cavs season. They had been struggling a lot. and they were building up. They had a 3-game homestand playing against some of the lesser teams in the Eastern Conference, and they finished off with what I said was probably the last meaningful game they were going to play on the road at Boston. And a lot of people were going to use that as a barometer for what we thought going into the postseason, because at that point, Boston had been pushing them the whole way, nipping at their heels, and people were starting to wonder about them. And what did Cleveland do? They went on the road to Boston, and they beat the ever-loving hell out of them right in the Garden. And so after that, everyone's like, all right, we can downgrade this. And there was that feeling of inevitability that we're far away from now. I'm interested, and Fitz, I'd ask you this. Are results in the regular season enough for you to think what you're thinking about these groups? If we see players star during the regular season, a time of year that's been so devalued in the NBA calendar, is that enough for you to say, oh, this was worth it? Some of this realignment, the chance for the Eastern Conference to grab this is worth it? Or is the inevitability of knowing that we're probably still going to get Cleveland Golden State Part 4 going to downgrade all of that in everyone's mind?
I don't think it does this year. I think the action this summer has made the NBA more interesting next year. I truly believe that. And I look at the East, and I think that you've got basically two different ways you're going to watch basketball this year. You're going to watch the East, and you're going to watch rising stars. And you mentioned Isaiah and John Wall, and we've talked about Giannis, I think, ad nauseum on all of our shows, because he's a guy everybody sees star potential in. So you're looking at these guys and you're saying, hey, there's a crop of guys that are just fun to watch. It's fun basketball to watch. And then what you've seen this summer is just the star power seems to feel like it's all gone over there. But you also have interesting types of basketball. The Rockets are going to play interesting basketball. It will be different than what many of us have seen, the way they've constructed that team. So I think that there's two different ways you can watch the NBA this regular season, which, even though we all agree it's probably a 2-horse race, as it has been for the last 3 years, it will be for the 4th. I just think in and of itself, that makes it more interesting. Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable 4G LTE network. I do want to kind of go to this odds thing. And, Vegas is smarter than most of us. So the reason Vegas always thrives is Vegas always finds a way to make money, right? So you think about the odds, and all the 76ers did this offseason was add, of the veterans, of the players we know, J.J. Redick and Amir Johnson. And after doing that, they have the 5th best odds to win the East. Only the Cavs, Celtics, Wizards, Bucks have better odds. So on the one hand, I think, man, that means the East stinks. But then I could also say, hey, there's a viable argument that the Celtics are going to have, obviously, an exciting team this year. The Wizards, you mentioned John Wall, going to be an exciting team this year. The Bucks have Giannis, somebody we like to watch. And I think everybody's eyeballs are on the 76ers right now, because there's a lot of youth. And you're looking at that saying, hey, in 3 or 4 years, when the window starts to close in the West, could the 76ers be the new super team?
Well, they also drafted Markelle Fultz, #1 overall, after training for that pick. So there's a lot to look forward to on the horizon. You're right. We've talked about kind of how you structure your team now, knowing that you've got to go against these other teams. But at the very least, what we've seen is Boston's probably the chief example of this, because Danny Ainge just kept pushing things off. And I keep wondering aloud when that's not going to be enough for Boston fans. But they seem to be content to ride this wave, make sure that they're set on the right guy that puts them in the best potential situation to do this after LeBron. And a lot of other teams like this, you see that timeline potentially mirroring that too.
Well, and it feels like a battle of the super teams in the West to me, because of the way we've seen free agency go this year. It feels like a battle of future super teams to me in the East. I think that's, in a beautiful world, if the NBA could have it however they want it, I think that's the way that it would come together. I think that's what they're hoping their audience gets to see. And I think that's what we're all hoping for, because what I want to be is more engaged in the regular season, more engaged in the playoffs, and then get the final we want.
That's all you want?
That's all I want.
You
That's
sure?
Not asking too much.
No.
That's not asking too much. Straight ahead, more on the Durant discount with the Warriors. And why is there such a huge difference between contracts in the NBA, Major League Baseball, and NFL? We'll get to that next on Mike and Mike on ESPN Radio and ESPN. Let's get into big checks that won't bounce. Golden State, as you heard and off the top, Kevin Durant, they agree on a 2-year, $53 million deal. Player option in the second deal. Durant makes $25 million next season. That sounds like a lot of money. But here's what's significant about that signing. It's about $9 million less than the max that he could have secured from the Warriors, and it is less than he made this season. So you go around, you join a super team, you become the finals MVP, you accomplish everything you set out for, and you take a pay cut. It was staggering news when we all heard it.
Well, it's only in the world of sports can we pull this off in this day and age, where we were told all along Kevin Durant was going to take less.
Yeah, but
we knew all along Kevin Durant was going to take less. And then now he comes out and actually takes less, and we go, oh, my God, did you hear? Kevin Durant took less.
That's a lot less, though. I mean, there's less and there's like there's a lot less.
Well, what did we expect it to be? When you hear that this guy, why he wanted to do this, it was so they could go out and do exactly what they did this offseason. Keep Andre Iguodala, keep Sean Livingston, because we're talking about it before the show, and almost everyone assumed one of those guys was going to get away. Someone was going to succumb to the idea that, I'm not like Kevin Durant and Steph, where I know my money is coming. It's going to be there. Everyone else, there's tiers in pro sports of athletes. There's the guys that can ring chase because they're chasing history. There's the guys that know they have their money coming. Blake Griffin's of the world just got paid with the Clippers. And then there's everyone else who is in a mad dash to try and get as much money as they can while they've got the chance. That limited window for earning potential in pro sports. And you figured Sean Livingston might fall into that category. Andre Iguodala has a little more of a background in this, but even still, if he had gone and taken some of that money that Sacramento was reportedly going to throw his way, wouldn't have blamed any of them.
I think when you ask how much less, when you think about $9 million less, I mean, yes, I realize for most of us it's like play money essentially. It's hard for anybody sitting here or anybody listening or anybody watching to really conceptualize what $35 million can look like. So it's easy to say, yeah, but he's still making 25. That's obviously. But there's a point when you are a competitive athlete at the highest level and you just leave $9 million on the table. That's a lot less. I mean, that's essentially a third of your contract. So you're coming off it wasn't even an adjustment year. You're coming off a year where you made an epic team better and you got them to the finals, you got them over the hump, and you got the finals MVP. You accomplished everything that was laid out in front of you, and then you take a third pay cut? I mean, that's substantial.
We've also seen this before, though, and this is why people should honestly, if you're looking for a reason to be afraid of what Golden State represents, be afraid because of this, because they're starting to mimic what we've seen in the other great franchises and what it takes to be great over a long period of time. They're going to draw a lot of comparisons in the basketball world of the San Antonio Spurs, where Tim Duncan, as he got along in his career, managed to take less and less and less, but I immediately thought of Tom Brady and the Patriots. Tom Brady has been taking almost half his worth, what feels like for years now, in order to give a sport that's strapped much more by the salary cap and by the fact that their top players can make their full market value. And so when that guy goes out there and gives that team flexibility every year in a sport with way more variables, we've seen the sustained run of excellence that they've been able to have. Now take a sport where there's 5 guys on the court, and you know that you've got 4 of those best guys already on your team. That's dangerous.
You're listening to Mike and Mike on ESPN Radio and ESPN2. He's Mike Golick Jr. I'm Jason Fitz, sitting in for the guys. At $25 million, Kevin Durant is scheduled to be the 14th highest paid player in the NBA this season. I mean, that's a big number, 14th. I mean, that's a low number for somebody of his status, of his stature. And if you're one of the many people that want to hop on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed and blow us both up for talking about millionaires and their pay cuts, again, I come to the fact that the job market is what the job market is. And their job market allows for him to make a certain amount of money. Walking away from a third of it, you're right, Tom Brady, a very good comparison in that. Our own Chris Haynes broke the story yesterday. I want you to hear from him. He's going to join us next, but here's what he had to say yesterday about it.
That is a selfless act. A guy who's coming off of winning the finals, MVP, coming back and taking about $9 million less than what his max is. He's doing that to be able to have the Warriors go out there and have enough room to be able to bring somebody else in via free agency. And I was also told that part of that 2-year deal, the second year, is a player option in which he would likely, as of right now, decline that player option, do it again, and then the following year, he will qualify for the super max. Now, what that means right now for the Warriors, look, you got a guy that's willing to make sure this core sticks together. He declined his option in the first place last month, which allowed the Warriors to retain the bird rights to Sean Livingston and Andre Iguodala. And so now you see how they were able to get paid, and Durant is still doing that. Man, I've never seen anything like this. When I got the word this was going down, I was like, what? Excuse me, how much for Durant? We're talking Durant here? And I'm surprised. I think like everybody else is.
That's Chris Haynes talking about that. Chris, Mike and Mike, presented by Progressive Insurance. Here's our guest list for today, by the way. Chris Haynes going to join us at 7:30. Antonio Davis at 8:30. Brian Windhorst at 9. All phone guests join us on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. If you miss any of those guests, you can listen to all 4 hours of Mike and Mike on demand in the ESPN app. So this raises a great question about Kevin Durant, because a year ago, he was the biggest villain in the NBA. I mean, almost a year ago today, he became the villain of the NBA. Today, he becomes the hero, essentially, for agreeing to take less money. Does this, for most of the NBA fans, people watching it, in your mind, does this sort of spin his image back around?
I don't think so. I think the only thing that's going to do that is time, because as you pointed out yesterday in a different discussion, we lose context as we go further down the line. And so while some people might be able to point back to this, the people who live through it, everyone else is just going to look back and say Kevin Durant, X-time champion, however many championships they end up with here in Golden State for him in his career. That's the only thing that changes the dialogue around Kevin Durant, because think about the crowd that was criticizing him to begin with. People that are basically just looking for reasons to hate on these guys being able to make the decisions that they want. So they really think they're going to buy into the altruism of a guy who's going to make $25 million just because he gave up 9 of those?
And that's a fair point, but what does this say for Kevin Durant? Does this just mean he's in a different mental state in your mind than he was a year ago? Because he had opportunity to stay in Oklahoma City, chose not to, chose to go and play, as we said yesterday, with his friends. So he goes to play with his friends. Now they win a championship. They're on fire. Some would argue that if Kevin had stayed where he was, that maybe Oklahoma City could have put pieces around him to contend. So he wasn't willing to do that. He wasn't even willing to stay in Oklahoma City. Now not only is he willing to be a teammate and stay in Golden State, obviously, which we expected, he's willing to take less money to do that. That's significant to me. That says something about what's happening at Golden State that he didn't feel could happen at Oklahoma City.
Well, it is, and think about what we've heard all NBA offseason in regards to other free agents, whether it's Paul George or Gordon Hayward, these teams talking about, specifically with Paul George, though, showing him their culture inside the locker room to convince him that maybe, you know what, next summer you don't need to go in LA. We've got it pretty good here. You should stick around with us. Kevin Durant could have gone there, grabbed one ring, and said, all right, I'm good. I'm going to go get paid elsewhere, and then I can start my legacy, sort of like LeBron James did, how that Cleveland championship meant more. And Kevin Durant could have gone somewhere and said, I'm going to be that solo act now that I know the drill, and do that. But he said, no. Look what I found here. We have a chance to create something the likes of which the league's never seen if we keep this thing together. And he put that value over anything else in this situation. And to some level, that deserves absolutely to be commended.
He's Mike Golick Jr. I'm Jason Fitz, sitting in for the guys. It's a July 4th doubleheader. Tune in today. The Yankees host the Blue Jays, followed by the Red Sox at Rangers, presented by Sprint, ExxonMobil, and KFC. Coverage begins at 12:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN Radio, ESPNRadio.com, and the ESPN app. You mentioned Tom Brady earlier. Interesting career earnings for Tom Brady, $196 million. Career earnings for Peyton Manning, $249 million. That's a substantial difference when you talk about leaving money on the table.
Yeah, for those top-end guys that you all assume are going to push the market and set the price for everyone else and do all this. And listen, that's between 2 all-time greats. Like, that's the difference between Peyton Manning's 2 Super Bowls and just the fact that Tom Brady happens to have 5 now, among a number of other things. This isn't the only factor, but it's always been one of the contributors. And that sets a kind of a message down to everyone else. Like, oh, the best guy we have, the guy that in your case in Durant was just your finals MVP, is willing to do this? What am I willing to do for this team now?
Well, you talk about that, and Tom Brady never, by the way, he's never been the highest paid quarterback in the NFL in any given season. He's praised for it. And then you talk about notable NBA players that regularly have taken less money. Tim Duncan. I mean, Tim Duncan is sort of a Superman to so many people. Dirk Nowitzki, they love him, right? But then you turn around and you say Kevin Durant, you don't get that same love. At some point, you have to look at it and say whether or not you love the decision that got him there. Whether or not you love how he got there, he got there, and now that he is there, he's doing everything sort of the right way. He's doing everything that we've praised other athletes for doing.
All the rest of those guys you mentioned, though, are homegrown talents, and there's just nothing like loving your own home cooking the way people do with those athletes there. And worth noting that all the rest of those guys, there's the sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, because all of those guys, Dirk got his one but he's kind of the exception because they've never really done a great job of putting stellar teammates around him the way that's happened for Tim Duncan and the way that happened for Dwayne Wade in Miami for a lot of years. So usually there's a reward, and with Kevin Durant here, you saw everyone they were able to keep intact. There's your reward.
Well, keeping everybody intact screams back to what's being created at Golden State, which is something we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about. But none of that is capable of happening. At some point, you have to look at what happened yesterday, not just for the significance, because the other side of it is it's significant for Golden State. It's also significant for NBA players that are looking around. I mean, how do players, you've been in professional locker rooms, how do players feel when they see a guy that's leaving cash on the table? Because that's sort of that moment that, you know, if you and I are both walking into a room and, you know, Travis is having a hard time lifting a box and you go over and offer to help him, I feel bad if I didn't go over and offer to help him lift a box, you know? So now how is there this real life moment where everybody looks around and says, if he's going to leave money on the table, should we be leaving money on the table? I mean, it sets sort of an interesting conversation precedent for players, too.
I don't think, because we talked about before, everyone's in a different position. Kevin Durant's in a position where he believes he can leave money on the table because he knows he's still going to have a chance to make plenty of it later. He's made a bunch already. He put it off for a year, and that's absolutely, like I said, worth a round of applause for him. But the rest of these guys, they all are in a position where they're in more of that cash grab mode for a lot of guys. And so it makes you say in other ways, all right, he's willing to do that. We got to double down this effort. To that point, he invested in us. Let's invest back in this process. But league-wide, when you talk about setting the market and things like that, I don't think guys pay attention to that nearly as much as people think. You're cognizant of it, but the top guys are still going to get paid what they're paid. Especially in the NBA where there are maximums, there are all these different things set in place to restrict how much you can make on the top end. That's much less of a concern in my mind.
But the two sides of that, I would say, is that one, NBA contracts are guaranteed, and part of that is the constant conversation about injury.
Well, they're not guaranteed. I mean, they're guaranteed. They're not required to be guaranteed, right, but most of them are guaranteed.
Most of them are guaranteed. And so part of the conversation about guaranteed contracts is about protection against injury. That's why players want it. So while we know that Durant can get paid in a couple of years, you can't on the one hand say we want guaranteed contracts for protection of injury and not say, hey, he's at least taking a risk on the other hand, because if he does sustain some sort of injury in the next couple of years, it could change his ability to get that max contract we've talked about. That's side number one. And side number two, if you're a GM for a pro team, aren't you walking in today to your guys, or even next summer, you're walking into your guys and saying, hey, what we really need from you today is a little bit of a Durant situation. We want to put more pieces around you because ultimately there isn't a hard cap in the NBA. They can go over the cap in the NBA. It's just a matter of a luxury tax. So what Kevin Durant really did was saved his team a luxury tax bill that allows them to stay together. But it's not like other sports where there's a hard cap and they have no choice.
No, and that's the point we kind of talked about yesterday on the other side is we're getting in the staring contest now where it's how much are owners willing to spend of their own money to do this. And yes, to your point, in a world where we're seeing more and more stars join up together, how many of them are going to be willing to make a sacrifice like this potentially going forward? We talked about it a lot with Chris Paul before the trade happened, but the idea that if he had the options were sign in LA for that 5-year supermax deal or leave for greener pastures and sign somewhere else, he would be leaving something like $50 million on the table or whatever it was. And that's the NBA world we're moving into.
Durant has the 5th highest salary among players to sign since free agency opened. All right, the 6th, J.J. Redick at $23 million. So superstar Durant making just $2 million more than J.J. Redick next year. Kind of crazy. Straight ahead, Durant said yes to his future with the Warriors. Someone said no to the Cavs and LeBron yesterday. You'll find out who.